Welcome to this week's Finance in 5, where we dive into the current events shaping Australia's real estate market. Huge episode today. We're going to go through some of the changing demographics of investor lending. We're going to walk you through where you can buy a house for less than you pay for rent. And finally, we're going to take you through some of the shifting sands, the changing requirements in apartment living, why 3-bedroom might be the new 2-bedroom. Let's jump right in.
Welcome to the Buying Your First Home podcast, your personal guide through the Australian housing market. Here we tackle the big questions and the small details that come up when buying your first home. From financial prep to finding the right neighbourhood, we're here to ensure that you've got all the knowledge at your fingertips. So let's take the first step towards unlocking the door to your new home.
So starting from the top, Simon, 46% of Commonwealth Bank's new property investors were millennials. This was a pretty surprising stat for me when people were sort of saying, the cost of living, ownership of homes is out of reach. This kind of bucked that trend.
Yeah, it's pretty surprising news, actually. And there's a few other interesting things going on here. So the millennials are the biggest investors by far, followed by the Gen Xers. And 1/3 of all millennial investors actually purchase the properties on their own. So in comparison to other generations where investing has been kind of a group project, we're seeing more of the solo players here who are just investing and following their own financial goals without necessarily having a partner involved in any way. So pretty fascinating, actually.
Yeah, and the average age of the millennial investor in this, and that's people born between 1981 to 1996, was 43 years old, and the average loan size was $528,000. So it's not like people pursuing sort of multi-million-dollar properties here. It's kind of like pretty meat and veg sort of properties, I guess, in the Australian context, considering the median house price in Sydney is over $1 million. Brisbane's getting up there, Melbourne's similar. But yeah, it could kind of underscore what we've spoken about in the last couple of episodes is the whole rent vesting piece, buying where you can afford and renting where you want to live. Because also it's kind of surprising some of the locations there, Simon, for the new property investment.
Yeah, that's right. So interestingly enough, the top postcodes for property investment purchases in 2023 were very central ones. So in the 2000 postcode, which is the Sydney CBD, 329, which is West Melbourne, including Hoppers Crossing, 2765, which is Northwest Sydney, North Melbourne, Northwest Sydney. So a lot of like central locations. So it seems more that a lot of people are sort of doing the rent vesting thing, perhaps buying an investment property somewhere central, which they will think will be easy to rent out. And then they're choosing to live where they want to live. And it's quite interesting to see that sort of shift. And I think you were surprised because we thought people would be buying more in further out locations where perhaps they can get better rental yields for a bit of bargain.
Yeah, that's why I was pretty surprised. And I'm not sure if this could be CBA specific. So obviously this is the Commonwealth Bank's only their data. So it doesn't include other banks' data. I know CBA are a bit more, I guess, aggressive in some of those central high density postcodes compared to other banks that have restrictions on LVRs and deposit amounts. But yeah, I think definitely it could be a case of, it's easy to rent out, potentially lower maintenance, because presumably if it's in Sydney CBD, it's going to be a unit, you're not really getting a house there. So it's sort of less to worry about and probably easier to look after. So yeah, I think it's interesting. And I guess the positive, the silver lining here is it can feel pretty hard in the current market trying to find a home to live in with some of those median house prices that are, especially if you're trying to buy on your own, which a big proportion of people are doing here. So it could be worth thinking about if you're getting priced out as a first home buyer, pivoting and looking at investment options and that side of things. But I guess down that similar vein, Simon, our second article, there's a bunch of Australian suburbs that you found here with mortgage repayments under $570 a week. And that's under the median weekly rental of $570 in 2023. So that's kind of what got to this amount.
Yeah, that's right. So rental prices are going up. I think the median in Brisbane now is up over 600, around 620. So I thought, well, where can you buy a house for less than the median rent? And there are some pretty surprising places here. You might need to take a bit of a drive to get to them, but you can buy a house for $160,000 in Collinsville, which is in the Whitsunday region. So if you had an 80% LVR loan, you'd only have a weekly mortgage repayment of $200. Absolute bargain. There's a few other interesting places as well. These are a bit more regional, obviously. If you're looking at a lower house price, you are typically pretty far out of the central capital city zones. But you can go to Cooper Pedy in South Australia with a median house price of $110,000. You can have a mortgage for just $135 a week. With the added bonus, Cooper Pedy is known for its opal mining. So you could always go out on the weekends and dig around for some opals, might even find enough opals to pay for your house itself. I mean, there's a pretty big list here. Like there's, in general, just across the states, Queensland has about 120 different suburbs where you can get a house for less than the median rent. As we scroll down, South Australia's got 97 spots. Western Australia's got a handful. And funnily enough, the ACT is the only place where you can't actually buy a house for less than what it would cost you in rent. So yeah, just some interesting stuff here. Obviously, not everyone's going to want to live somewhere regional, but the general gist here, I think, is, there are different opportunities if you widen your net. So if you're looking for a house and you're finding that you're being priced out, sometimes it's worth challenging your assumptions about, where you want to live and whether or not you might be able to make a significant change in terms of choosing a different place to live to find a house that is affordable. And you might be surprised about what these areas can offer. Also, coming back to the rent vesting approach, looking into these suburbs with cheaper house prices is another great way to look at maybe getting onto the property ladder.
No, definitely. And I guess down that similar vein, a lot of people I'm sort of speaking to, ideally you'd love a house as your first home to live in. But the reality is with our cities, with the way that the changing landscape is, units are potentially the way to get in the market. And interestingly, unit prices have risen 2% so far this year compared to houses at 1.48%. So, Simon, I know typical units about $196,000 cheaper on a home based on median house prices, but what are some of the advantages here and what do some of the numbers look like?
Yeah, I think this is just a bit of a trend that we're seeing because house prices are getting more expensive and a lot of people just can't afford them, which is understandable. So I think the shift here is that a lot of people are looking at units as a good option for their first home or even for a forever home. A lot of people are changing what they want out of a place to live. So surprisingly enough, there's a bit of a difference as well in terms of where you are. So if you were in Sydney, you can get an apartment for a median price of $562,000 cheaper than a house. So it actually brings the affordability thing into realism. In Canberra and Melbourne, you can get an apartment for a median price of about $300,000 to $350,000 cheaper, and Brisbane's in the same ballpark. So they are more affordable, and they also offer a lot of advantages as well, and compared to livability, being close to public transport and social things, etc.
Yeah, and I think the other shift I've seen a bit is, I guess, back to that first article, but in general, investors are getting more interested in the unit space again, just because you're potentially getting a better yield compared to a house. It's low maintenance, so you're not having to worry about yards and fixing things up. The body corporate takes care of that. And ultimately, to your point, Simon, it's that sort of walk score impact. It's the location. It's being able to live closer to the amenities. A unit in the 2000 Sydney CBD is going to be a lot easier to rent than a house in Coober Pedy, even if there are open minds. It's just that difference that I think it's much more interesting for investors and homeowners alike.
Yeah, and I bought my first house, it was really a townhouse, and that was just slightly south of the Adelaide CBD. We did look at houses, but they were unaffordable at the time, and we thought, well, a 2-bedroom townhouse, which is literally walking distance to the CBD in Unley, it had a lot of advantages, and then when I went overseas for work, we could rent that out with no problems at all. So I think it is worth looking at houses and units rather, and apartments as an option because they give you flexibility and they have that entry price, which is much more achievable.
Yeah. Well, on to our next article. And this is sort of in the similar vein. Unit living is sort of getting more embraced by Australian families. So this was something, 10 years ago, I wouldn't say it was unheard of, but for my family that grew up in Italy, for example, my mum grew up there, apartment living was a norm. This was 50 years ago. Everyone lived in an apartment. In Europe, it's much more common. It's just a standard thing. In Australia, we've got more space, more homes, and it wasn't as common here. What didn't exist. These days, it seems to be changing, and some of the data is indicating those changes are afoot, right, Simon?
Yeah, so there was a recent study from the University of New South Wales, and they actually found that more Australian families with children are now choosing to live in apartments, which is kind of in line with a lot of other places in the world, as you've said. But the issue here is that most apartments in Australia aren't really suitable for families. They don't really have the right size or the shapes. They're all these cookie-cutter homes that are built for investors. And it's interesting to think about why that might be. So, as you say, like in Europe and in a lot of other capital cities all over the world, people are used to living in apartments, so they build them for families. And whereas here in Australia, everyone's who's had a family typically has lived in a house with a backyard. And so they haven't built those apartments that are actually suitable for families. And so kind of a carry-on effect from the long-term Australian dream of having the house with the backyard.
Yeah, and I know even dealing with some property developers over the last few years, it just wasn't feasible for them to do projects. It made more sense to more or less fit in more units as 1 and 2 bedrooms. You can have smaller floor plates, fit more apartments and more sales. And with obviously the town planning and the red tape, it kind of had a better feasibility compared to a 3-bedroom that you might get less apartments and less yield. So it's interesting to see some of the newer apartment stock. It's less investor focused, but definitely a lot of stuff out there just doesn't quite match up to what the changing demands are now.
Yeah, and what's wild is that if you're in Sydney and you want to buy a 3-bedroom apartment, it's actually cheaper to buy a house with the same number of bedrooms. So a 3-bedroom apartment has a median price of 1.264 million in Sydney, and the median house price for the same number of bedrooms is 1.16. So you're spending $100,000 more to live in an apartment versus in a house. So there's this disconnect here in between availability of stock and I think this luxury idea of having more than 2 bedrooms in an apartment means that you're rich. I think that's also kind of a sort of subtext here.
Interesting that. And different topic. It was all the rage this week. Bluey, the Sign episode. It was their first extended episode. But there's some interesting numbers in this article from ABC talking about, well, if the Healers actually owned a home, how could they afford it? Assume it's in Red Hill, Paddington area in Brisbane. The prices there, it's pretty toppy. So walk us through this.
So this is kind of a classic thing, right, in a lot of fictional shows. So, the show Friends, they were living in central Manhattan and there was an out-of-work actor, a coffee waitress. Like these people had a multi-million-dollar apartment and they didn't have the salaries to afford it. And they talk about a rent-controlled apartment or other things for the sake of the show, but it's just sometimes there's a bit of unrealism in terms of what you can really afford based on what you make. So the mum, Chili, she works in airport security, and Dad Bandit, well, he's an archaeologist. So they're not really the type of people who are making a huge amount of money, which there's nothing wrong with that, but they are living in a house on the top of the hill in Paddington with city views. And a real estate agent from Space Property said that if they sold the house today, if it was like it's described in the cartoon, it would be worth $6 million.
Crazy. Yeah, so it just goes to show that sort of mismatch. And they're going to go through the salaries and everything else. But yeah, I don't want to spoil the episode, but yeah, you don't end up finding a sale price anyway. So, all right, Simon, so wrapping us off the top, some interesting data there for millennials. We'll include the links to the pack, but definitely good news if you're trying to get in the market and you're feeling like you're getting left behind. There's always that rent vesting, the investing route that you can consider. It might give you more borrowing capacity and allow you to buy a place in areas that you want and you can afford, and you can kind of live where it's convenient for work and where it might make sense.
So next we were looking at some Australian suburbs where you can afford a mortgage for less than $570 a week, which is the median rent. Some of them are a bit out there, but it's worth a conversation about where you can buy and looking to buy where you can afford, or rent vesting in the same places. Following that, we were looking at the unit prices, and so they're actually rising higher than the rates of houses this year so far, and a few reasons why that might be. Next, Jaden, we were looking at apartment living and sort of the changes in demographics as to why people are choosing to live with apartments with children. And finally, we had a good old chat about Bluey's family house, which was a huge episode last Sunday, and we looked at how much it would really sell for if they sold it today.
That's for today, guys. If you like the episode, make sure to leave a review. And if you need any help for finance, hit us up at huntsgalloway.com.au. Until next time, see ya.